Hello, I'm Anabel González, non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to TradeWinds, our virtual event series, where we discuss the future of global trade in the era of the pandemic with leading policymakers and experts from across the world, and also accompanied by participants from 84 countries and counting. This is our episode number 10 of TradeWinds, and we will explore the theme of agricultural trade and COVID-19, trade barriers, food security, and WTO reform. A very important topic as countries across all regions make sure that people have timely access to safe, sufficient, and nutritious food in the middle of the pandemic, and as they plan about rebuilding better. So to lead our conversation today, I am delighted to have with us two world experts on trade in agriculture. Let me first introduce Joe Glauber, a senior research fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute and a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. Prior to joining IFPRI, Joe spent over 30 years at the US Department of Agriculture, including as chief economist from 2008 to 2014. Joe has written extensively on crop insurance, agricultural policy, and agricultural trade issues. Also, from 2007 to 2009, Joe was the chief US agricultural negotiator in the WTO, at the time when the Doha round got as close as ever to get done. And that's when I met him. I'm also very pleased to introduce Sherman Robinson, a wonderful colleague of mine, a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute. Sherman is a leading expert on economic simulation models with strong research interests in trade, economic growth, agricultural and resource issues, climate change adaptation, and developing countries, among others. He has also published widely in international trade, growth strategies, and agricultural economics. Sherman is also a colleague of Joe at IFPRI, where he served for 10 years as director of the trade and macroeconomic divisions, among others. So welcome to both of you, and thank you very much for being here with us at TradeWinds. I will turn it over to Joe and Sherman in a moment. For you in the audience, please get ready to submit your questions using the Q&A feature in the Zoom platform, and we will try to get to as many of them as possible. So in the initial days of COVID-19, the pandemic and its containment measures placed unprecedented stress on all segments of food supply chains, including farm production, food processing, transports and logistics, and final demand. Rising concerns of global food crisis were further exacerbated by the adoption of export curbs on the part of several countries, mostly in March and April this year. Now, despite logistical bottlenecks and problems in some places and in some products, the current supply-demand situation is very different from that at the start of the 2007-2008 global food crisis. World food production prospects are positive, stocks are high, international food prices are relatively low, and food supply chains have continued to flow, with some of these early restrictions having lapsed or being removed. Still, some significant challenges lie ahead, and let me mention three of them. First, the food security situation is dire in some countries in Africa, in South Asia, and even in Latin America, otherwise an agricultural powerhouse. Loss of jobs and livelihoods are rapidly increasing food insecurity, with the FAO estimating that more than 250 million people will suffer acute hunger by the end of this year. Second, while critical to move food from the 570 million farmers across the world to the 7.7 billion people, trade still faces significant tariff and non-tariff barriers. Intra-regional trade could play a greater role in Africa, for example, while new technologies and digital trade have demonstrated their potential to connect food demand with supply. And third, the massive support programs used to address the economic dimensions of the pandemic will bring increased tension and friction to agricultural markets. In these conditions, the need to reform the WTO agreement in agriculture to help bring about freer and fairer agricultural trade and strengthen food systems is yet more pressing. So let me turn over now to Joe and ask you, Joe, is the world at risk that in addition to a global health and economic crisis, there will be a food crisis like that of 2007, 2008, and beyond? Or is it fair to say that there is no looming global food security crisis, at least arising from supply shortages? And what about other transmission channels? So welcome, Joe, and thanks for being here at TradeWinds.
Yeah, no, thanks very much, Anabel. You said in your introductory comments, and I would agree wholeheartedly, that grain supplies, oilseed supplies in the world are more than adequate to meet world food needs. Current forecasts show record crops for wheat, rice, maize, and soybeans. Global stock levels, if you look at them as a percent of use, we often look at just how much grain is on hand to feed the world. Those levels are almost twice the levels of what they were in 2007, 2008. So I think in that sense, the world's in a much better place than it was 10, 15 years ago. And I think while we've seen a lot of trade disruptions in manufacturing goods and other things, bulk trade actually has tended to perform pretty well. The WTO statistics on trade that were just released yesterday show that agricultural trade's down a little bit, but compared to manufacturing trade, compared to energy products, it's again quite negligible. But there are regional issues, as you've mentioned. I think that the interregional trade in areas like sub-Saharan Africa, where the costs of trade are just extremely high relative to other regions of the world, only exacerbate these problems of trying to move food at times when there are difficulties. And COVID has presented challenges, both in terms of its health impacts and also in terms of its disruptions, in terms of the policies that have been put in place to contain it. So we've seen disruptions in the supply chains, we've seen disruptions, health issues in areas like meat packing plants and other things. So these are all big challenges for the food security system, but I think, as you mentioned, the biggest right now, I think, will be the recessionary impacts and the loss of jobs, loss of income, which will unfortunately increase malnutrition, I think. And to meet those needs, I think we're going to have to try to work to try to turn around the world economy.
Anabel, you're muted.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Joe, for those initial remarks. Let me now turn it over to you, Sherman, and basically ask you the following. What is your assessment of the performance of food supply chains at times of COVID and the containment measures? Have supply chains shown resilience, or has the pandemic impacted different crops in different ways? What about different regions? Joe was making a bit of a reference to Africa. So what is your view about this?
Well, I think we have to understand that this COVID-19 pandemic shock on these economies, both from the pandemic and the lockdown policies necessary to control it, it's unprecedented in past. Most times recessions start at the top with financial crisis of confidence, foreign exchange crises, and then trickle down through the financial institutions to the rest of the economy. This time it's bottom up. We created it at the bottom in order to control this. And we basically closed down, or demand collapsed, for contact intensive sectors. And they turn out to be both contact intensive in customers, restaurants, etc., supermarkets, and also in their production processes, meatpacking plants. During the US, in March and April, or for a while, the entire automobile industry in North America closed for a while because they couldn't guarantee safety on the assembly lines. So that's caused a very asymmetric set of shocks. These are labor-intensive, low-skill-intensive sectors with people without adequate social safety nets, and it's really hammered them. everywhere, pretty much worldwide. We're seeing that dramatically in the US, where the social safety net is much less good, say, than in Europe. And those have tended to be parts of the agricultural supply chains are that. So what's happened is, for example, in the US, you saw that the supply chain for restaurants stopped because restaurants stopped demanding stuff. And you had farms that were specific to that supply chain had rotting vegetables and things like that. And then, but the supply chains to supermarkets weren't up to the task because and it took a while. It's impressive to see how the private sector has adapted. You have seen that. I don't see any of that problem anymore. You've seen shifts in the supply chains from restaurants to other things. Food stores have changed their patterns of operation, much more relying on online ordering, for example. So they've been able to rapidly adapt their inventory control software to allow consumers to work on it. So we are seeing that, but it is asymmetric. We were at first expecting this bump up, a V-shaped recovery. It didn't happen. Most of us didn't think it would happen. But now we're seeing a slower recovery, but now we're seeing a kind of mixed recovery, what's sometimes called a K-shaped recovery. The top end is improving, the bottom end is not. So you're still seeing serious damage down, and that's a lot where the agriculture is. Capital intensive agriculture, as pretty much what Joe was describing, has done just fine, pretty much globally. Labor intensive agriculture is suffering. So you're seeing problems in the US with itinerant farm workers are picking fruits and vegetables. They are in packed living conditions, and COVID-19 is starting to spread among them. So you are seeing problems in nutritious foods. I mean, the foods for a varied diet, but it's still working. I mean, I think agriculture has responded very successfully to this. So, and I think that's true worldwide. But what we're seeing worldwide, as Joe points out, it's not a food shortage, food security problem. It's a Matricen famine. It is a lower purchasing power down at the bottom of the distribution. And I think that's the problem we're observing. And it isn't unique to the US, or it's everywhere. We're seeing it across the world. So we've ended up with an asymmetric hit, and we haven't quite dealt with it yet. I mean, I think globally, and I think so the food security issues to me are really as much income support as bringing in the World Food Program, for example. I think at least we're going to see that for a while. Over to you.
So thank you very much, Sherman. It's interesting, I think, in addition to what both of you have said, that for a number of developing countries, reduced demand for some of their crops is also having an impact there. And I remember earlier in the pandemic, for instance, watching pictures of flowers in Kenya in the road, just because demand in Europe collapsed because, you know, no more weddings, no more events. And that had a significant impact on flower growers, on an industry that's close to $500 million in the country. So I guess that from that perspective, even though from the supply side perspective, things look good. And as Sherman was saying, amid all the challenges supply chains sort of have resisted, still we are facing sort of different problems in different countries, like this one, I think, in Kenya, right?
Yeah, I would add just.
Right. So, yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was just going to make a point on the things like the flower industry. The other thing that has really hurt has been transportation costs for things like air freight. You know, when you have people not traveling, then a lot fewer planes are actually going. You know, the traffic that we saw just plummet in April, May, June really hurt perishables and other things that depend on high cost transportation, got even higher cost, and I think that hurt as well.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Good point on that is that the trade in that kind of goods are very high value. And
Yeah.
so it's an important export crop in labor-intensive developing countries, shipping high-value goods like cut flowers or fruits and vegetables to developed country markets, and that's been badly disrupted.
Yeah, exactly. So, I think that for all the reassurances that we're not in a replay of the 2007, 2008, the reality, as you both have mentioned, is that there are countries across different regions facing this increased food insecurity situation. So you referred a little bit to this, but maybe Sherman, do you want to come in and share a bit more about what can the world do to improve food security in the short term? I'm not talking about the medium term, but right now, what is it that countries could do to increase the food security situation?
Well, I guess, and I'm looking at South Africa in particular with some work at IFPRI, it really is income support at the bottom is where I think the major problem is. And the developing countries are not institutionally set up very well for that. South Africa is something of an exception in that case. So I think that's the concern we should be having. Certainly true in the US. We are having food insecurity among poor people in the US in major ways. Food banks are doing incredible business and being overwhelmed by the need. So it's exactly the same issue. It's not a food shortage. It is an income collapse at the bottom end of the distribution, both with the demand for low-skilled workers, unemployment rates hit them much more heavily, and the safety nets are much less well developed outside of Europe. Europe is actually doing very well in this. England not quite so well, but Asia has done very well. High income.
Yeah. So I don't know, you'd like to add something to that, Joe, and maybe you could also talk a little bit more about the role of intra-regional trade to bring about greater food security, because you were mentioning about the challenges in Africa with the high trade costs and how this is impacting, food moving from one place to another. But maybe you'd like to say a word about this.
Yeah, a couple things. Let me start with that. I think that we do a little bit of work at IFPRI tracking intra-regional trade, informal trade in Africa. We have a couple of projects going on in West Africa and in East Africa. And there, I think the picture is a little bit mixed. We have seen some declines on some of the trade corridors that we're monitoring in West Africa. East Africa, again, mixed. I think what's surprising is how resilient trade is, and that's one thing about informal trade. I think it's very resilient. That you do see trade moving, but I think the one thing I would say about all this situation. The good news is we don't see the export restrictions that we saw in 2007-8, and that actually is a significant factor, because I think if you look at what was going on in March and April, you saw a number of countries put on restrictions. Fortunately, they were very short-lived, and I think mostly covered old crop, not the new crop when it came in. But if you consider how export-dependent or import-dependent a number of countries are for grains, and the Near East, for example, for wheat, or areas of Africa for corn, maize, or rice, very high. And so if you have a country saying that they're going to restrict rice exports or wheat exports, like what we saw in the early part of the spring, that raised some concerns. But again, those were quickly, I think for the most part, those countries realized that supplies were adequate, that they didn't need to implement those policies. And of course, that was really one of the troubling things in 2007-8, which exacerbated those problems, were trade policy restrictions. So.
Yeah. I think that's a very good point, and which also, leads me to another question which I had, which is the role of agricultural trade in all of this. Because one interesting thing, of course, is that agricultural trade has increased significantly since the crisis. Population growth, urbanization, rising incomes, have been driving demand for more non-traditional foods. Whereas we know climate change has been increasing the variability in production, making it more difficult for local farmers to satisfy domestic needs every year. Yet we know that protectionism has been gaining an upper hand in many parts of the world. So, Joe, let me maybe start with you. What kind of policies are needed to underpin future agricultural trade growth? And what trade reforms can countries put in place to improve the functioning of food systems?
Yeah, well, this gets, again, as you say, this is certainly has been happening over the last 20 years. Prior to COVID, import penetration, that is imports as a percent of consumption, has increased for most agricultural commodities over the last 25 years. These trends are expected to continue. Food sources actually have become more diversified, which is an interesting, if you look at where people are getting their food, of course, developing countries are supplying a much greater proportion of exports and are accounting for a much larger share of imports than they were 25 years ago. And the example I always, South America is a great example of being now a major supplier, and particularly in an off season for things like soybeans, but also maize, poultry, all sorts of meat products, fruits and vegetables. So all these are important, and they're only going to get more important as we look at climate change and other things that are going to shift production to other places. And unfortunately, that means a lot of areas that are importers now are going to continue to be importers, even as their own agricultural production potentially is affected. So I think that just calls for a more open trading environment. That means lower border measures, but also decreased production distortions by disciplining agricultural subsidies. I think it reduces, where possible, export restrictions that we've seen, get some disciplines on those. I mean, we've unfortunately, while there has been some progress over the last, since the collapse of Doha back around in 2008, we need to get back to the negotiating table and make some progress there, I think.
Yeah, I'll come back to the negotiations at the WTO and the role of the agreement in agriculture, because I think it's probably more pressing now than ever. So Sherman, before coming to you, let me just remind our audience that you can please send in your questions. We have a question which I think is more of a comment to one of the points made by Sherman before, and it's from an anonymous attendee, and this person basically says, what kind of income support does South Africa have when so much of its population is in the slums? And I think this points to this, Sherman was making this point, which is a bit the challenge for developing countries. On the one hand, not much fiscal space for many of them, but on the other, informality and other dynamics, making it very difficult for payments when they are available for payments to reach people. So I don't know, Sherman, if you want to sort of say a quick word on this, but then I also like to hear your views on what policies do you think are needed to underpin future agricultural trade growth?
Let's go to the second first and then go back to income support. I agree with Joe fully. I mean, we really do want to improve trade liberalization globally. It is important, and it's going to become increasingly more important as due to climate change, the countries that are producing the food and the countries that demand the food are going to be far distance apart. Africa is special and interesting. There's been a lot of work trying to argue for increased regional integration within Africa. And I think that's commendable. My view of these regional trade agreements that we're seeing proliferate is you could think of them as two kind of broad categories. One is just pure market access. You want to get goods across an international border and you want to make it easier. The other are agreements that really have a major component of improving regional integration with behind the border work. So in Africa, the major expenses are enormous costs, trade and transport margins of getting foods from remote producers to markets within and across borders. So any any regional agreement that's going to look to integrate these economies should have some major efforts at infrastructure investment for transport and communications, major improvement in the ability to move stuff around, and as well as just the technical issue of getting across the border. Regional trade agreements are mixed in that. And I think that's going to be important. In terms of income support, I was struck when we were working on South Africa to find that there is a very significant government direct income support to poor people compared to other developing countries. Not great, we're not talking about Sweden or Scandinavia, but certainly compared to other developing countries, it's major budgetary work. So, you know, I guess you could build on that and try to target it better. For the other developing countries, I think it's the sort of thing that IFPRI does for a living. How do you do basically safety net support for very poor households?
Yeah, that's right. Thank you, Sherman. So following up on the issue of regional integration and regional trade, we have a question here from Ahmad Mukhtar, and he says it's a question to both of you. Do you think that enhancing regional food trade and shortening the supply chains could improve global food security? So what role for regional trade for improving global food security, or is it more about a regional dimension of this?
Joe?
Yeah, sure. No, okay, I'll go first. Yeah, I think, I think regional agreements certainly can facilitate that sort of development. I get a little worried when I hear things like shortening supply chains, because I think supply chains are wonderful things in many respects, and it does bring you know, it can give countries access to very low cost goods, and that's important for consumers. It's important for producers who use those goods for intermediate products and other things. But I think, you know, Sherman's comments about regional integration, I think, are really important. I mean, I think if you look at the challenges in a region like Africa, or West Africa, where I'm most familiar, you just see the cost of transporting goods. Again, it's the time it costs to get through a border patrol, the intermediate stops along the way. We've been involved with a project that's been funded by USAID that's been looking at a number of corridors in West Africa of shipping food from, say, Burkina Faso to Ghana or to Nigeria, and just trying to track both the volumes that are being transported, because that's a big problem. We just don't have very good data on trade. A lot of it goes unrecorded. But then the other thing is this project is also monitoring costs, and I think it's just striking how high those costs can be. And I think that, you know, so when you talk about all these other policies that sound really good on paper, like grain, you know, stabilizing grain prices through storage regimes and things like that, they pale in comparison, I think, in terms of reducing transportation costs and transactions costs, but within a country, but also across the region.
Yeah. There are some studies that show that for some of these corridors, trade costs are equivalent to a tariff of about 250%.
That's
so
right.
with those numbers, it's very, very difficult for trade to flow within the region. Now, I think, Joe, you mentioned the issue of agricultural subsidies. And we know this is a very important topic. We have one question here from Hannah Monikin, which says many countries, including and especially the US, are pumping money into their agricultural sectors, especially amid the crisis. WTO members have already questioned the US on if its support goes beyond its limits. And what are the implications for domestic reform at the WTO? So, Joe, let me turn over to you to discuss a little bit more this issue of trade and production distorting agricultural subsidies, and what can WTO rules do about it?
Yeah, no, that it's of course have become a very, very big issue, if it wasn't one already. I mean, remember, even before COVID, over the last 2 years, due to the trade war with China, the US government has provided over $28 billion to US producers. In addition, with COVID, another $23 billion in support to compensate producers for, lower farm receipts, because the prices have been adversely affected by the pandemic. But that's in addition to the existing farm programs that also already pay out, $10–15 billion annually when you consider crop insurance and the price and income support programs. So these have been unprecedented levels of support. The U.S. will be, by my calculations at least, over its AMS commitments for 2019, likely over its AMS commitments for 2020. That's the binding levels set by under the Agreement on Agriculture. And the question will be, I think, what happens in 2021. If this is a one-time or even 3-year experience, if things go back to normal, then I think the world will want to take up disciplining agricultural support, or that those pressures will still remain. But the problem is, if this continues, I mean, this obviously. It's understandable that countries want to protect producers, but at what point do these supports insulate producers from markets, in the sense of the market signals to react to lower prices? And if they continue, if not, then they distort production, and in which case a lot of other countries, producers in a lot of other countries, are adversely affected. And those oftentimes are in countries, like Sherman suggested, that don't have the means to compensate their producers in the same way. So I think serious reforms are needed. It's been one of the real tragedies of the collapse of trade talks, is that more progress, that we weren't able to make progress in market access and domestic support. Thankfully, some of those parts of the agreement, like trade facilitation, like export subsidies, have been addressed since then. But we still there's just so many areas that need to be addressed. And I think a period like this, where you see such heavy subsidies going into the agricultural sector, just bring that home even more.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very good point. In terms of the subsidies, as you were saying, it's not only the nature of the subsidies highly distorting, but it's the amount of the subsidies, which have many countries concerned. And a key question, of course, is is this a shift in policy, or is this sort of like a one-off, or a short period of time? And I think only time will tell, I guess. But this puts a lot of pressure on the WTO to reignite negotiations in agriculture, and we know that they have been going on, but probably more is required in this context. Sherman, do you want to come in also on this topic, and related to this, because Joe was talking about the need for reforms on domestic support, but also on market access, because we know that agricultural production still continues to be protected by high barriers around the world. We have one question that brings another element to this discussion on barriers to agriculture, and this is from Kariraj Apadu, and basically says there are a lot of barriers to agricultural trade, as there are a number of norms and standards which need to be respected. I wonder what needs to be done to facilitate this process so that developing countries can align to the sanitary and phytosanitary requirements of importing countries. So this is a different dimension. But if you want to comment on WTO reform first, and maybe then address a little bit this topic of standards in agriculture, I think it'd be interesting.
A couple of points on that. On the WTO, I consider the Uruguay round to have been an impressive achievement, with lessons from agriculture that I think may turn out to be useful for others. The definition of trade distorting agricultural support policies, and the creation of the green box and yellow box and amber box and red box distorting policies was impressive. It's got problems, and yet I'm absolutely astounded at how quickly we managed to bring back the, I thought, completely dead Commodity Credit Corporation. That was nothing left of it, and suddenly it was out pumping large amounts of support to farmers, and it's a real step back, and it's not unique to the US, I'm afraid. So I think a major part of WTO reform should be revisiting the progress of the Uruguay round. It wasn't perfect, but it needs to be revisited and built upon. I think it's like we're starting over on that one. Sanitary and phytosanitary standards, they're complicated. If the high value goods that you want to, that are where agriculture in developing countries is making a lot of money, has to meet the standards of its markets where they're going to. So you cannot ship potatoes to Europe from the Middle East that are going to have nasty diseases and rot in them. If you can meet those standards, you really, all of a sudden, a very good high value market opens up to you. And that's been true of Central American fruits and vegetables to the US, but you have to meet them. And that's not cheap. And they need support in doing that. You need to, I actually saw work years ago in translating the Codex Alimentarius into Spanish so that Costa Rica could renew its exports of I think it was raspberries or something up to the US. So the other side of that is they also are really useful protectionist devices misused. So one story I heard was the Japanese at one point were limiting tulip bulb imports because they said they could contain some awful bug that would hurt the Japanese tulip industry. And the only way to do it was to cut every tulip bulb in half to check. And it turns out tulip bulbs don't work so well after they've been cut in half. So you see that kind of, you have to set up, it's complicated. And it's why trade lawyers make a lot of money. But you really do have to face it. And I think a lot of that is to get, and that has to be done globally, internationally. That's very, very hard to do bilaterally because you end up with all sorts of weird standards.
Yeah, thank you, Sherman. Thanks. Joe, you want to come in on that one?
Yeah, the only thing I want to add to that, and it's just to kind of reinforce that last point that Sherman made, and that is how important it is to do this multilaterally. I think one of the problems we're seeing with the proliferation of free trade agreements everywhere is that different standards are being agreed to, and that poses problems and added costs for you're essentially telling countries in certain markets that might have a free trade agreement with the US and a free trade agreement with the EU that they have to pick what standard they're going to produce, and effectively shutting themselves out of the other market or bifurcating themselves that way. And I think this is an area like domestic support that also needs to be done multilaterally. You don't find disciplines on domestic support in free trade agreements. People, typically don't touch that. And I think it points to why we need to see more work being done in the WTO along these lines.
Yeah, I think that this is a very relevant point, because if there's an area where rules need to be multilateral, it's precisely, I guess, in the area of agricultural trade, because many of the different topics, as you say, are really global in nature and cannot be tackled and are actually not tackled in the context of FTA negotiations. Yes. So we've been talking about the U.S., but we have a good friend of ours, another agricultural expert, Martin Piñeiro, who says hi and also asked, how do you think that the EU farm to fork will affect food trade and food systems? We also had another question from someone in the audience concerned precisely about the same point. This is Chiara Della Pasqua, and she says the EU will soon start implementing their farm to fork strategy, which will have an impact on trade. Partners will be requested more and more to raise sustainability standards. How do you see this unfolding in the future? And will the EU be successful in bringing its sustainability ambitions in the WTO? So who would like to take an initial cut at this?
One point on the standards. The standards are crucial for high value goods because that's where they are. You know, that's where the most detail. You have seen the private sector respond. So, for example, in the food to fork, you'll see something like McDonald's in developing countries actually starting at the farm level and imposing standards all the way up the supply chain to the McDonald's stores in Asia. And those standards are probably higher than would be required under the standard sanitary phytosanitary standards. So you do see that. What's very hard about that is small farmers have trouble participating in that. And supermarket standards, the same thing. They're not set up to deal really with small farmers. So you have a real problem of potentially bifurcating the market between a high-end, high volume, where these standards are not the major cost to retrieve, but leaving out small farmers. And then you need to figure out ways to do that, like creating farm cooperatives. But you have to enforce the standards.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Sherman. Joe, you want to come in?
Yeah, no, I agree with Sherman. I think this is where the losers are the poor farmers that aren't able to adopt. But the reality is this is the way the world's moving, and I think that the sustainability standards, I think climate will be another one that will be very important. Then in those discussions are one way or another are going to move to the WTO at some point. I think is we're seeing border taxes and climate smart agricultural policies that by any other term would be called domestic support policies. And so I think those things will be debated, and they need to be debated in the WTO. So I think this is, this isn't unique to Europe. We're seeing it in the US as well. I would agree wholeheartedly with Sherman that a lot of this we're seeing with private standards. That is, companies recognizing what consumers are looking for, and then are ensuring that where they are sourcing those materials are compliant with those standards. So.
Yeah. Well, I think one important point also is that from the perspective of consumers, standards provide sort of an assurance of the safety of a product, of course, but also I think from the perspective of many producers in developing countries, the issue of institutional capacity building is critical in this context. And I remember from the time when I worked at the WTO that we had there a standards and development trade facility housed in the agricultural division, which aimed precisely to support institutional development on standards in developing countries, and actually having a solid track record in this area. So let me bring in another topic, which is a little bit related to the issue of support, but in a different way to agriculture. We have a question here from Bruno Schneider, who says, could you discuss the importance of improving access to financing at a time when large banks supplying capital to the commodity industry are exiting the industry? And so there is the concern, and he further adds, so can government guarantee trade mechanism revive the slowdown in the commodities industry as a result of those large banks exiting the market? So financing on commodities trade, and I think this relates to a broader concern about trade finance in times of crisis. So I don't know, Joe, you wanna come in?
Let me take a quick shot at it, and then I'll let Sherman add. But I clearly export credits were of highly contentious aspect discussion during the Doha round. We've seen in Nairobi there were some disciplines put on export credits, but it presents a challenge. At what point are making financing available mean subsidized finance and subsidized credit terms, which act as export subsidies? And I think that's where the concern would be: is to what extent government provided credits or back credits, if they are long-term in nature and other things where they can act pretty much like an export subsidy. I think that those should be a concern, and we need to be very careful as we move down that road, all the while recognizing that financing obviously is an issue.
Thank you, Joe. Sherman, you want to say a word on this?
Yeah, I would agree. Again, it's an area where the need is great. It's clear the private banks, these are specialty financial systems, and private banks don't seem to be very enthusiastic about it. They are subject to this abuse, but they are needed, and I think that's true. I think we're also seeing that in developing countries. Again, it's this smallholder versus large holder access to credit. It isn't just for trade, it's just for agricultural investment. And I think we need to be revisiting the notion of the agricultural development banks, because you're not seeing the big international banks are not doing much in this area. So, and some of it's trade related, but it's also bringing the smallholder farmers into the commercial system, providing them with banking services and credit services. And we need to be getting clever about that.
Yeah. So let me shift gears now a little bit to what I think is a bright spot resulting from the pandemic, which is the acceleration of digital trade in food products, as in other products as well. That we know that amid the lockdowns and social distancing, digital trade in food products has increased significantly. We have a question here also from R.T. Krishnan in this regard about food e-commerce. So I wonder, what do you think is the potential for digital platforms to improve food systems? We know that one of the challenges in agricultural trade is how to connect supply and demand, and presumably these platforms could play an important role. And also, how can these new technologies support safer, more sustainable food? So, Joe, you would like to come in?
Sure. No, I think, clearly here in the U.S., we've seen this enormous growth in e-commerce during the pandemic. I mean, people having to source food, ordering food online, ordering either from restaurants or ordering it from grocery stores for pickup. You still have transportation issues. I mean, until we figure out how to move food, actually move food online, I think that you still have to get that product from one place to another, and I think that has been another challenge here in the U.S. As people have tried to adopt, and even I know some of the stores that were offering online shopping, the delays were so large initially that just because they didn't have the means of actually stocking and getting transporting the food. But so those are you still have those sorts of impediments that need to be worked through, and I think that again, you get back to the same line that you need to maintain low barriers to entry, you need to minimize border measures, you need to try to keep costs down and the efficiency of transportation, improve the efficiency of moving it to keep those supply chains efficient and supple.
Yeah. Well, I think it points, your comments point to the fact that digital trade, for digital trade to prosper, reduction in trade costs in goods is actually critical. So Sherman, you have a comment on this?
Yes, it's certainly dramatic increase on e-commerce during this period. I mean, in an amazingly short time. And I've seen some studies of some very, very large number of people who never had ordered online are all of a sudden ordering online all over the place. but Joe's absolutely right. It's the next step is how do you actually get the product to them? And that turns out to be fairly labor intensive. So you are seeing and meeting those demands. If somebody's going to be picking food up to, I ordered online, somebody's got to put it together and package it in order to send it to me. So, and those tend to be labor intensive. So you are seeing a shift in the structure of employment in this. That's actually not a bad thing. It's just a major change and major rapid. Then you need to worry about the nature of those employees. Do they have, are they being exploited, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, that goes with this. The other danger is that you seriously have market organization problems. You worry about monopolies. So, and I think that's a serious issue as you conglomerate that. You start getting rid of a lot of the competition in that system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So our audience is also concerned about the relationship between agricultural trade and environmental sustainability. We have a couple of questions in this regard. One of them basically makes the point about what will be, Arne Melchior basically asks, what will be the post-COVID perspective on the increase over time in airborne agricultural trade concerning environmental sustainability? There are also other questions, and a lot of them are also related to this new EU Farm to Fork initiative from Alejandro Patiño, also mentioning whether is it really trying to create green alliances, or is this really more about a protectionist model in the agricultural sector, maybe not science-based and others? So we know that the relationship between trade and agriculture and environmental sustainability is a complex one, but maybe I'd like to hear some thoughts of yours in this area. Sherman, you want to come in?
I guess one issue is as we really move to serious dealing with climate change, and it's going to be a WTO issue that's not unique to agriculture, is do you use trade sanctions to enforce doing environmental things? In other words, if everybody else does a CO2 tax and the US does not, how do we discipline the US? And the only available tool would be trade. So then you would have countervailing tariffs to correct for the US being a low cost, high CO2 generating country. There's different views on it, but that may even be acceptable under the WTO current rules. It's viewed. It is a sort of unfair subsidy at the US end. Do we extend that to agricultural products? How do we measure that? Trade sanctions are clearly not the first best way to go in terms of getting agreement on climate change, but we are going to have to deal with those issues, and it's getting to be more serious and more widely understood that it's more serious.
Thank you, Sherman. Joe, you want to say a word?
Yeah, I think the difficulty or the challenge, I guess, is the fact that the costs of implementing these things differ so widely, among countries and producers. And so anytime you put in a regime like this, it's going to have differential costs that some are going to be hurt much more, others may be helped just because they're able to adopt. I think these things, it's easy to dismiss a lot of these regulations as being protectionist, but I think they are in one sense responding to consumer demands and societal demands that are being made. I think the trick is to how to do it equitably, how to do it in a non-discriminating way, how to do it in a way that doesn't favor domestic producers. So these are all things that are first principles of the GATT in one sense, but I agree. I think that these things are going to be debated more and more seriously as we see these policies being implemented in largely in developed countries, but they will have enormous ramifications for developing countries.
Absolutely, and this is a topic that could take a whole Trade Winds episode to discuss for sure. I think, we've touched upon many different issues, but as we come to the end of our program, let me ask to each of you, as the pandemic plays out, governments for sure could benefit from early lessons. In your view, what are key takeaways to lessen potential shocks, to leverage trade, and to lay the foundations to build better food systems? Sherman, you want to start with your sort of final message to our audience?
Well, very quickly, I guess linking it up to the trade side and the WTO reform, I think a major issue we are going to have to face is what's called special and differential treatment for developing countries under the WTO. It's now not working. I think that's a fair assessment of it. But it is important. I think developing countries do have special interests. Climate is going to be very interesting. The developing country view of climate justice is they didn't cause this problem, and yet they're going to be seriously adversely affected, and they may have to bear very high costs of adaptation and mitigation. So maybe they have a case for getting some kind of new special and differential treatment under the WTO going forward as we start negotiating these things.
Thank you, Sherman. Joe?
Yeah, from the pandemic, I'd say a number of things. One would be transparency, and I think that this cannot be overlooked. I look at some of the export restrictions that were put in initially. I think the WTO did a great job of getting out, saying, okay, look, we understand you're doing these things. Just let us know about them. We have a reporting process, and I think that worked surprisingly well. I think other organizations like my own, IFPRI, has also done a good job of tracking export restrictions and those sorts of things. But the primary things here are trying to minimize the regulatory barriers and keeping borders open. And I think the one lesson that we're going to take away from all of this is flexibility, and how to, it doesn't mean that if we were to get hit with a pandemic 3 years from now, we wouldn't still be facing large costs and other things. But I think that hopefully we'll have a better idea of how to respond so that we don't spend months and years trying to deal with this. And I would say with COVID, at least, we still have a very big problem in that we're still seeing large areas of the world, including the US, where we still are seeing this isn't under control yet. So I think hopefully we can get this under control, and then I think things like the economy and trade and other things will bounce back.
All right. Well, thank you very much to Joe Glauber and Sherman Robinson for a great conversation on agricultural trade and COVID-19. Thank you very much to our audience as well for your continued participation and for some great questions today. I would also like to thank Adam Posen, the president of the PIIE, and my colleagues at Peterson for their support in making Trade Winds possible. And let me ask you in the audience to stay tuned for our next episode of Trade Winds on Wednesday, October 21st. So until then, thank you very much and goodbye.
Thanks, Anabel.